Welcome back to the deep dive. Sometimes you just get stuck in a rut and it feels impossible to climb out.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're diving into today, the cycle of depression.
Oh, wow.
You sent us this fascinating YouTube video from Healthy Gamer G, and the host, Dr. K, brings a totally unique perspective. I
Really?
mean, a psychiatrist who also trained to be a monk for 5 years.
Yeah.
You can't get more intriguing than that.
You're right. It's a pretty unique background.
Right.
And the way he blends those two worlds is what makes his video so insightful.
Yeah.
He approaches depression from a fresh angle, focusing on how our perception can actually trap us in that downward spiral.
Okay, so perception. That's a pretty big concept. Where does he even begin to unpack that?
He starts by comparing depression to a sneaky, relentless virus like HIV/AIDS. Both attack your defenses and make it incredibly hard to bounce back.
Wow, that's a powerful analogy, but what does that have to do with how we see the world?
Well, he argues that the real culprit is what he calls cognitive biases. Those little mental shortcuts our brains take that can really mess with our thinking when we're depressed. They're like those funhouse mirrors at a carnival, distorting everything we see.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection. So these biases are like the virus's secret weapon, making it even harder to shake off the negativity.
Exactly. And one of the biggest tricks these biases play is making us see neutral situations as totally negative. Like imagine you're in the break room at work and a colleague walks by without saying hi.
Oh, I've been there. You immediately start overthinking. Did I do something? Did they not like me when it's probably nothing personal at all?
Right. But depression can lash on to that seemingly insignificant moment and turn it into evidence that the world is against you. And just like that, you're spiraling down a rabbit hole of negativity.
That's so true. It's like our brains become hyper-focused on searching for proof to confirm our worst fears, even if it means twisting reality to fit the narrative.
And to make matters worse, Dr. K explains that these biases don't just affect how we interpret individual situations. They can actually create a selection bias, where our minds start filtering out all the positive stuff and fixating on the negative.
So it's like wearing those horse blinders, only seeing the bad stuff and totally missing the good.
Exactly. He uses the example of a performance review. You might receive a ton of positive feedback, but if there's one piece of criticism, that's all you'll remember. Your brain essentially ignores the praise and latches on to that single negative comment.
It's like that saying, one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. But in this case, it's one negative thought spoiling an entire day or even week. And speaking of making things seem worse, he also talked about how depression messes with our memories, right?
You're talking about overgeneralization. It's another sneaky tactic depression uses to keep us stuck. Instead of remembering specific details about an event, we just hold on to this vague, all-encompassing sense of negativity.
He gave that example of someone saying, my life sucks. But when you ask them to pinpoint why they can't provide any concrete examples,
Right? It's like they've just painted their entire life with this broad brush of negativity, erasing all the nuances and complexities that actually make up our experiences. And this lack of specificity makes it almost impossible to challenge or reframe those negative beliefs.
it's like trying to argue with a fog. It's just this amorphous, overwhelming cloud of bad vibes. But this is all pretty heavy stuff. Does he offer any solutions for breaking out of these patterns?
That's where things get really interesting. He argues that traditional psychotherapy often misses a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Wait, really? But therapy is all about understanding your thoughts and feelings, right?
It is, but Dr. K points out that while therapy can help us reframe those thoughts and process our emotions, it can't directly change how we perceive the world. It's like teaching you how to read a map without actually taking you on the journey.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So if therapy isn't the whole answer, what does he suggest?
He draws a parallel with something you might not expect: yoga, specifically a type of meditation called vipassana, which he says is all about training your perception, almost like a mental workout.
So instead of lifting weights, we're lifting thoughts. I'm not sure I'm following.
It's more about learning to observe your thoughts and feelings without getting swept away by them. Imagine you're sitting by a river, watching the water flow by. You see the leaves, the branches, maybe a fish or two, but you don't jump in and get carried away of the current.
Okay, I can see that. But how does watching your thoughts help you break free from depression's grip?
Dr. K suggests that this kind of mindful observation can help us separate the actual situation from the stories our minds create around it. He calls this the mentality-materiality exercise.
Mentality-materiality. That sounds intense. Break it down for me.
Think about it this way. Let's say you see a cute dog on the street. The materiality is simply that a four-legged furry creature. The mentality is all the stuff we layer on top. Oh, it's so adorable. I want to pet it. I bet it's super friendly.
So the dog is just existing, but our minds are creating this whole narrative around it.
Exactly. And Dr. K argues that depression tricks us into applying this same narrative building to everything, often with a negative spin. We start seeing threats and judgments where they don't exist.
Like in that break room example, the materiality is just a colleague grabbing coffee, but my depressed mentality turns it into a personal rejection.
Right. So the materiality exercise is about learning to spot those thought patterns and separate the objective reality from our subjective interpretations.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could be helpful. By recognizing that our thoughts aren't always facts, we can start to loosen depression's grip. But how do we actually put this into practice?
He suggests a few techniques. One is to literally make a pro-con list for things we perceive as negative. It forces our brains to consider alternative perspectives.
So instead of spiraling into everyone at work hates me, I could create a list that includes things like my coworkers often ask for my input on projects, or I received positive feedback on my last presentation.
Exactly. It's about challenging those automatic negative interpretations and reminding ourselves that there's usually more to the story than our initial, often fear-based reaction.
That's actually a really simple but powerful idea. Any other techniques?
Remember that overgeneralization we talked about, Dr. K, suggests something pretty interesting to combat that, removing the I from our thinking.
Wait, what does that even mean?
It's about recognizing that not everything is about us. When we step outside of that self-centered perspective, we can often see situations more objectively.
So instead of thinking, my life sucks, I might think, this particular situation is challenging, or I'm feeling frustrated right now. It's about getting specific and taking myself out of the center of the drama.
Precisely. It's a subtle shift in language, but it can have a big impact on how we perceive and respond to challenges.
This whole conversation about perception is really making me think differently about how depression works. But there's one thing I'm still struggling with, this idea of depressive realism. Earlier, we said that depression distorts our thinking, but now we're saying that depressed people might actually be more accurate in their perceptions.
That's where things get really fascinating. Depressive realism is this almost paradoxical concept that suggests depressed individuals might actually be more realistic in their assessments of reality, but without the positive bias that most people have.
So they're seeing the world clearly, but it's a bleak view.
It's not quite that simple. While there's some evidence suggesting that depressed individuals might be more accurate in certain judgments, they're still prone to those negative biases we discussed earlier. They might be more accurate in assessing external situations, but their self-perceptions can be extremely harsh and distorted.
So it's not just about seeing the world accurately, it's also about how we view ourselves within that world.
Exactly. And that's where challenging those negative self-beliefs becomes so crucial. Even if we're seeing the external world more objectively, if our internal world is filled with self-criticism and negativity, it's going to impact our overall well-being.
It's like having a clear window, but looking through a dark lens.
And here's the really interesting part. Dr. K points out that this positive bias, while technically a distortion, might actually be essential for healthy human functioning. It gives us hope, motivates us, and helps us navigate the challenges of life.
So a little bit of delusion is actually good for us.
It's not so much about delusion as it is about having a balanced perspective. He even compares it to the reason why lotteries and loot boxes are so popular. We know the odds are stacked against us, but we still cling to that belief that we might just be the lucky one.
It's that inherent optimism, that belief in possibility that keeps us going. And while it might not always be grounded in reality, it serves an important psychological purpose. This whole discussion about depressive realism is really making me think. It challenges the idea that happiness is simply about seeing the world as it truly is. Maybe it's more about finding a balance between realism and optimism.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot where we're able to acknowledge the challenges and complexities of life without losing sight of the good, the hopeful, the possible.
But how do we find that balance, especially when we're struggling with depression and negativity? What concrete steps can we take to shift our perception and break free from this cycle?
That's where Dr. K's insights about yoga and meditation really come into play. So we were talking about how yoga and meditation might be able to help us find a better balance when it comes to dealing with depression and negativity.
Yeah, it sounds a little out there, but honestly, I'm open to anything at this point.
I think a lot of people are surprised to hear a psychiatrist, especially one who spent time as a monk, recommending these kinds of practices. But Dr. K really emphasizes that Vipassana meditation in particular can be incredibly powerful for training our perception.
Okay, back up for a second. What exactly is Vipassana meditation? Is it like what we see in movies where people are chanting Om and sitting in lotus pose?
Not quite. It's actually a very simple practice, but it can be quite challenging. Essentially, it involves paying close attention to your breath, your body, and your thoughts and feelings as they arise without judgment or trying to change them.
So it's kind of like that materiality exercise we discussed earlier. We're observing our thoughts and feelings as separate from ourselves, like those leaves floating down the river.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a sense of mindful awareness where we're not getting caught up in the content of our thoughts, but simply noticing them as they come and go.
But how does simply observing your thoughts actually help with depression? It seems a little passive, doesn't it?
It might seem passive, but it's actually a very active process. By practicing mindfulness regularly, we start to develop a greater awareness of those automatic negative thoughts that fuel depression. We see them as they arise, recognize them for what they are, just thoughts, not facts, and then we can choose how we want to respond to them.
So it's like we're building a mental muscle, strengthening our ability to detach from those negative thought patterns.
Exactly. And the more we practice, the better we get at catching those thoughts before they spiral out of control.
Hmm.
It's not about suppressing or denying negative thoughts. It's about recognizing that they don't have to control us. We have a choice.
This is all starting to make a lot of sense. By changing how we perceive our thoughts and feelings, we can actually change how we experience depression.
It's a powerful shift in perspective, and it can have a profound impact on our overall well-being. We move from feeling like victims of our circumstances to empowered agents of our own experience.
Wow, that's incredibly inspiring. I have to admit, I was a little skeptical at first, but this whole deep dive has been eye-opening. It's amazing how something as seemingly simple as shifting our perception can have such a significant impact on our experience of depression.
It's a reminder that we have more control over our thoughts and feelings than we often realize. By becoming more aware of our cognitive biases, practicing mindfulness, and challenging those negative interpretations, we can start to break free from that cycle of negativity and cultivate a more balanced and empowered experience.
Dr. K's perspective on depression blending psychiatry and mindfulness is truly unique. I love how he encourages us to see the world as it is not as we are. It's such a powerful reminder that our perception shapes our reality.
Absolutely. And it's a challenge to each of us to examine our own lenses, to ask ourselves, what aspects of my life might I be perceiving through a distorted lens? And how might challenging those perceptions lead to a more positive and empowered experience?
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new toolkit for understanding and managing depression. A huge thank you to you, our expert, for helping us unpack all of this.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, knowledge is power, and by understanding how our minds work, we can start to break free from those patterns that keep us stuck.
And to you, our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you some new insights and perhaps even a little bit of hope. Remember, you are not alone in this journey. There are tools and techniques that can help you find a path toward greater peace, balance, and well-being. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.